Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today I'm joined by Dr. Laura Cabrera, the Dorothy Foehr Huck and J. Lloyd Huck Chair in Neuroethics and a professor of engineering science and mechanics and philosophy at Penn State. Dr. Cabrera leads Penn State's Neuroethics Lab, where her team combines empirical research with conceptual and normative analysis to examine the intersection of brain technology, or brain science, technology, and ethics. Dr. Cabrera, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, to begin, could you give us a brief overview of your research interests and the work your lab is pursuing?
Sure. So a lot of my research interest really intersects with technology, the brain, and questions of humanity, right? Like the self, autonomy, responsibility. Um, Initially, a lot of my research was focused on public perceptions around distinct publics. So what clinicians think about something, what patients think about something. And then now I've moved a little bit more towards questions about governance and responsible innovation. So anything that has to do with neurotechnology and how we should be thinking about how to govern this type of technologies for now and the future, that has the current focus of my research.
Okay. One of the major areas of your research seems to be about deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. So I was curious, what is some of the work that you guys are doing in this particular niche of neurotechnology?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Within neurotechnologies, DBS has been one of, if not the one technology that I focus the most.
Okay.
I've done research on DBS both for Parkinson and depression. Those have been so far the two main indications. But the one with the longest has been for Parkinson, right? So it really started when I was an assistant faculty at Michigan State, and I had a colleague, a neurologist colleague, that really challenged me with the question to think about how early is too early to consider the brain stimulation for Parkinson. And
Okay.
that really pushed me into this thinking about, you're right, how early is too early? Because in the past, DBS for Parkinson used to be a last resort type of treatment. But now, with some new clinical trials and other evidence, it got moved. At least in the US, started to be shifted. So it was not, or it's not anymore, a treatment of last resort. So now, after 4 years, once you've been diagnosed, you can be eligible. So what
Okay.
does that mean for patient decision making? So that's actually one of the projects, one of the NIH grants that I have, which is focused on developing a decision aid for people undergoing DBS who have Parkinson.
Okay. What are some of the factors going behind like the decisions for people to like choose whether or not to partake in deep brain stimulation?
As with any intervention, any medical intervention, right? I think people generally think about, well, what am I getting out of this, right? What are the benefits? DBS does not cure Parkinson. So that's a very important consideration because, just treating the motor symptoms. And for patients whose motor symptoms are what is most bothersome, this is, a potentially very good treatment to pursue. But for patients whose main symptoms are more about balance or about, gait, there are other symptoms that DBS are, it's just not going to be very helpful. And so that's one, like make sure that you have the right expectations about the type of things that DBS is going to help you with and the type of things that it won't help you address. The other one is risks, right? Making sure that you know what risks are involved. It's brain surgery, right? So it's not
Right.
a trivial decision. So complications, these are things that patients have told us is a key important in the decision making. For many of our participants or people considering DBS, the other thing that we hear a lot is considerations about how invasive this is, right? And generally, invasiveness in this context is cashed out as, well, I'm going to have an implant in my brain,
Right.
right? So having this physical electrode implanted is a lot for some people, right?
Yeah.
And then for others, is also to know that this implant is going to be sending electricity into their brains. It makes them think of, science fiction
Yeah.
novels and things like that. So some of people have these concerns. So those would be like the three main areas, at least, the within the populations that I've researched the most. But I think another one is cost, right? and access. Because even if you wanted to have DBS, if you live in rural Pennsylvania, you might not have access to a clinic or easy access to a clinic where they can do the intervention. And it's an eligible intervention. So that means, some insurance will cover part of it, but there's still costs that patients have to make. So yeah.
I see. I guess one thing that's interesting there that you mentioned is like people don't know how to feel about having like technology that's, sending electricity in their brain. And I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on, for example, like the future, like the next couple of years with like brain computer interfaces and like the public perception on these kind of increasingly consumerized technologies where they're not necessarily for treating disease, but rather being made by like companies for improving, I guess, like for example, maybe like thought to text technology, for instance, or I guess what are some of your kind of thoughts on like these neurotechnologies that are being developed?
Yeah, well, I think I hear when you hear some of these developers, many think that this is the next obvious thing for everyone to do, right? To have a brain implant to be able to do things and be smarter and be able to do more of the things that we want to do. But when you ask the general public, even those that have a disorder for which they would benefit,
Oh,
there's a lot of hesitation, right? I think again, having something in your brain, even if you could have it with minimal invasive surgery, it still freaks some people out, right? It's
yeah,
like, why would I do that? And what if something goes wrong? Because it's one thing to have, infection in an implant in your hand versus in your brain.
right.
So there are, I think, I don't hear, and at least this is just based on my own interaction with discussions with patients. I don't see it as something that's going to be for the masses, right? I
Right.
think there are other ways in which we can improve ourselves that don't require a brain implant, right? And some
Yeah.
people, some companies are really moving to the wearables because that's a space that people are more willing to try, right? Like
Mhm.
a cap that is put on and then records your brain signals and lets you do something. Or I think Meta had this like an arm band and
Yeah.
yeah,
I've
like a
also heard of
waistband.
like
And I
headbands
guess
kind of. So yeah.
mm-hmm, yeah, headbands, measuring here, electricity recording from your waist, smartwatches, other type of sensors. A lot of people are working on sensors that are wearable that do not require implantation because I think that's a barrier where at least in, I guess, general population, I don't see people jumping to get a brain implant just for non-medical purposes.
Yeah. And continuing on this topic, I guess brain simulation or I guess devices that you put in your brain can sometimes there can be a fine line between treating a condition and as we just discussed, maybe like attempting to enhance our brain function. So, do you think that there might be some like I guess ethical like policies being kind of like constructed around this growing field of neurotechnology and how people will be kind of allowed to interact with it, or maybe even companies will be restricted in like their development of neurotechnology. I guess like how do you envision the policy side of this like innovation going on?
Yeah, so I think one of the big gaps that is being shown is that in terms of when these type of companies are within the medical domain, there's much robust regulation that once they leave for like the commercial side, right? Because you can already buy online TDCS cap, right? Like a transcranial direct current stimulation cap.
Yeah.
Maybe it has minimal effects on people, but it's out there and no one can stop you from buying it, at least not in the US, because we have like this idea of free market. We can buy many things, so restricting that is going to be hard based on the current situation that we have in the US. So it's hard to envision regulation because that we have with regulating things and not wanting to. I mean, we have not been able to regulate guns, right? So just I cannot envision that we can regulate this. I think governance in this aspect, in terms of regulation, is going to come more from professional societies, or maybe even the government perhaps, or other sources of information that's just gonna inform publics and then hope that they make a good decision. If you think about like plastic surgery, it's a bunch of people that do plastic surgery, and no one can say, well, you shall not have plastic surgery, right? Like there's no way that we can
Right.
not let someone pursue it. So and for a while I was doing a lot of work of around enhancement when I was a PhD student, and it has been fascinating because we've been debating this for decades, and it's just really hard to come with a policy that could prevent harms, societal harms that could come from widespread of these uses. And but we don't have good ways to do it in the type of societies that we have created.
Right.
I don't see an easy way. I'm trying to be, hopeful, but I'm also thinking that the younger generation can be brighter than us in terms of like how can we create more innovative ways of policing or keeping more, in check these type of interventions.
Yeah, I agree. Um, I guess enhancement is something very interesting. And one of the questions that I was kind of thinking about in my head is in professions where like brain function or maybe just like your speed in general, how you're processing things is very valuable. For example, like I guess we could take emergency medicine, for instance. Or maybe like outside of medicine too, just like sports, for example, like athletes. Could, for example, like an optional cognitive enhancement, uh, kind of pressure people into maybe thinking like, hey, that person is enhanced, and if I'm not enhanced, I'm going to be falling behind in this competitive profession or whatever it is that I'm doing. Because I feel like this could apply to many fields. And what is your kind of perspective on this social aspect of people kind of being influenced by each other in the future by maybe neurotechnology?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it now, right? Like we don't need to go into the future. Perhaps it's not the traditional definition of neurotech, but think about, you mentioned the case of the sports, right? Like in the sport sector, many people take drugs that will boost their performance, right? We try to police that, to prevent that, to sanction those that use it, in particular in professional settings where you want to have a fair playground, right? Like, so even if in your personal life you could use it so that you break your own record, if you are within the kind of like a sport that is regulated under certain rules, those rules that you should not use it, and if you use them, you're breaking the rules, right? So that's
Right.
a way in which we can regulate that.
Yeah.
With some of these technologies, the problem is that you cannot really, test for the use of a drug. Let's say some athletes are using the band that I mentioned earlier, the transcranial direct current stimulation. So it helps them train, it gives them, I mean, this is what the literature says, that, it can help you really be keen, like sharpen your abilities, like visual acuity and things like that. There's no way you can measure that. But also, like, at what point you cross the line of being not fair, right? Because there are athletes, there are teams that go and train in high level countries so that they can be ready, for competition somewhere else. And we cannot do anything about it. We cannot say, well, you shall not do this, because why is that unfair? I mean, just because you have more resources, right? I do see there's a layer of unfairness there, but we have not done anything to prevent these type of practices. And so, and this is just in the sport field.
Yeah.
In education, I don't know in your setting, but I know in my setting, a lot of students complain, right? Like, oh, well, everyone is using modafinil or Adderall or these other smart drugs that
Right.
are not for studying, they are for certain conditions, and people feel pressure, right? Because they say,
Yeah.
well, if all my classmates are taking it, if I don't take it, I'm not
Right.
gonna be able to be as successful as they are. So we're seeing that pressure now. I think it's really bad. I think it's really bad for the younger generations, and for the type of societies that we're creating, right? Where competition and success are key values, unfortunately. I mean,
Right.
this is what we're seeing. And that drives people to do things that they know are harmful for them, and for society with large. So I think we really need to rethink as societies, where are we heading with this?
Yeah. And I think it's really good that you mentioned that we don't have to think about it in the future. There's a lot of examples right now that kind of play on this ethical idea. And I guess one thing that you kind of mentioned that I just found really important is that as we start innovating like more technologies and even the ones that we currently have, they're widening like the barriers through kind of like the access door where like not everyone has access to these technologies. So um, you're just increasing a gap that becomes increasingly harder to cover for people. So I just think, as you said, it's very important that we pay attention to that, especially as we continue to make more technologies.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And okay, so as neurotechnologies are becoming better at recording our brain activity, and I think one of the big things that companies are doing right now when they're trying to innovate is they're collecting lots of data, like neural data. And I was wondering, like, is this going to be something that you think will continue for a while? Because I think that even as like neurotechnology is being developed, as we see even with like computers and phones, we tend to continue improving over many iterations, even when we think we've already have like a really good product, right? Apple's always releasing some new feature every single year. So I think that neural data collection is going to be like a really big thing, and it is right now, and it probably will be, especially in the next few decades. So I was curious, like, what are the kind of like ethics that go behind collecting neural data? For example, maybe if a company wanted to tailor a product for like younger people, what are like the ethics behind collecting neural data from a minor, for instance? So, yeah.
Yeah, let me just to be fully transparent here. I think the discussion about neural data is a little bit hype for my personal taste. Why do I say this? Because yes, it's true. With new technologies, we can collect neural data, and some will argue that neural data is much more sensitive type of data. Although some people also say, well, what about genetics? They're also sensitive, right? There's other data that is also seen sensitive because of the particular things that it tells about a person. So if you look into how big companies, say Meta, Google, they don't, I mean, I guess depending on the definition of neural data, but they're using a lot of how our keystrokes, where we stare in when we're looking at a website, the type of clicks, how many clicks we take to get to particular things. They are using all that data to know things about ourselves, right? To infer things. So the currency is not neural data, the currency is personal data, right?
Mhm.
So, and I think what is becoming more important is the integration of different types of personal data. So neural data is just going to be one layer within the amounts of information that we have about persons. And for me, the worry in that realm of personal data is, well, one, you can identify people much more quickly
Okay.
and easily. Um, and we are already, even with the collection of data that we currently have, already changing people's preferences, right? Like you saw that in for elections, for buying, and there are subtle ways we don't even notice because we think that, you know, that we don't have maybe like a device that is telling us what to do. But I think there are ways in which these companies have figured out of our, human weaknesses, perhaps, or well, maybe not necessarily weaknesses, right? It's part of being human. Like they know how um, our different systems work, to our decision making systems work, right? So they know exactly when to release certain advertisement here, or certain change of color here, or certain, and so I feel like we are really behind on catching up with this. And for me, what is most important, and something I keep telling whenever I have the chance, is that neural data is important, but we need to make it much broader than neural data,
I see.
right?
Yeah. Okay. And so my final question for you is going to be for kind of like people, like me included too, who might kind of like be a little worried about the future of neurotechnology and kind of like how like our nature as humans might be slightly threatened by the fact that we're going to have technology that could potentially affect like how our brains function, or maybe like create like in maybe 100 years we don't know what the average human, like the technology they're going to have, is going to look like. So I guess what kind of like ethical things would you, I guess, like repeat, or what kind of things would you just want to say to someone who might be worried about the kind of future of society, especially through this like kind of confusing time with AI as well?
I think the first thing I would say is be part of the conversation, right? Like I think oftentimes we feel like, well, this they making the decisions, I'm powerless here, and I think that has for many things that's what we enable, right? We as a society have enabled those that have power to make decisions for us, right? Like that's why we constantly, like catching up with, I need to take Ritalin, I need to use a latest gadget, I need to use, all of these AI so my essays look perfect. I don't know, all of these things that we're trying to conform with what others tell us that society should look like. But I think if we as a society, and by we I mean really everyone, were to really envision the type of futures that they would like, it would be very different to those futures that we've been sold by the CEOs of big companies, right? Um, and I think we have an opportunity to do better as a society in terms of really questioning, why are you pushing this to me? I don't want that. I don't need that. And so I think we need to feel re-empowered as a society. And that's why I said, like, be part of the conversation. That's one. The other one is, if we don't if we don't take part of this conversation, what's going to happen is that divide that you were mentioning that is key, right? You're going to see more people that are going to have more and more power, and most of us are just going to, have more struggles in life, have to do what others tell us, and lose freedoms and lose also opportunities in terms of, again, the futures that we want for ourselves, which I think is, that's a very important ethical thing for me at least. So this unjusticeness that can come from it, or is coming from it already. Um, and then there's other things that are maybe more philosophical in nature when we think about flourishing and well-being, but I think they're interrelated in terms of, what even makes us, human. And being human doesn't mean like you are detached from technology, because humans, since we, started having civilizations and things like that, we've used technology, and technology has always enabled us to do, good or different things. So technologies per se are not bad, right? But how we think of technology is becoming really important, because
Mhm.
is technology a tool for us to achieve great things, or is technology the thing that makes the great things and then we just chime along? So I think these questions about even purpose, accomplishment, well-being are going to be important as we think, how do we want to use these technologies, and what are the thresholds that we want to have in place, so that we don't use them, because we know that that's not the type of things that we as a society want to use, this type of technologies.
Yeah. I guess I really like the last point you had about technology because it's actually something I spoke about in my previous, or I don't know if you know Dr. Jason Eberl, but um, okay. So he was the person I interviewed for my previous interview, and he was basically talking about, or we were talking about Star Wars and kind of like the
Mm-hmm.
neuroethics in that science fiction world. And we talked about how it emphasized that technology is something that um, we should be careful of and not let ourselves kind of become like attached to or let technology control us. And one thing that's really easy to observe just in the world is how easily everyone's attached to their phones, for example. And for example, like the phone has a lot of benefits, but it's also really important to notice like the detrimental effects and like the cons of using phones, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think even on social media, there's this big like movement of apps that kind of like brick like your phone and basically force you to kind of like go out into the world, go outside, touch some grass instead of just
Yeah.
being glued to your technology. So I think the technology is really important. And I also kind of think that with neurotechnology specifically, it's important to kind of separate the hype from like the reality and how it's actually going to be implemented. And as you said, like make sure to like voice people should be voicing their concerns and opinions on um, like how they view it rather than just being like, oh, that's so cool that we can do that. Maybe the question instead of like, can we do that should be like, should we do that, for instance, or like
Mm-hmm.
how should we implement this technology rather than just always asking like, how can we innovate this technology to be even better? So yeah.
Yeah, I think the why should we do this,
Mhm.
or how can we do this in a responsible manner, and how do we I think oftentimes what happens in innovation, you people have a narrow view of what society needs, and oftentimes those are disempowered. They don't even have a say in, right? And so the futures that we are kind of in the path to are the futures for a very narrow part of the population. But I think we're missing the larger picture, and I think that's what we need to do more. How do we innovate to really help everyone, like bring everyone on board in what
Yeah.
instead of just keep making richer the ones that are already rich.
Yeah, because the technology is going to have an impact on everyone's life, even if they're
Mm-hmm.
not the ones using it, right? Because they're going to be indirectly impacted. And I just think like my biggest takeaway from what you just said is we need to have basically like all stakeholders be involved, like people from all walks of life, people from like everywhere, like even the like parts of life that I, for example, like probably am not even thinking about right now because they're going to be affected. So it's important that we're all kind of having a voice in this matter. And I think history also teaches us like the dangers of what will happen if you have like a very narrow set of people kind of dictating where things are going to go. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Just to share an example of this last part of involving every stakeholder, I was in Mexico giving a talk. One of the speakers said like, "Oh, in a few years, everyone is going to have a brain implant, right?" And so, kind of in the conversation with my colleagues, she said to me, "What? Can you imagine? Like, no way I would let anyone putting a brain implant on my head. I mean, what if something goes wrong and I cannot pay for it to be removed and I cannot pay to be." And so they're worrying about the economics of even like having it. Let's say that they can afford the first time, but like if it breaks, if it needs a repair, they are thinking of things that are very much, things that we should be considering when we implant things in ourselves, right? But oftentimes they don't even come out in the conversations.
yeah, that's a really good point because I didn't even think about like that kind of aspect. Like, what if you need it removed? Or actually, now like that inspires more questions in me. I'm like, what if you get kind of like, or what if you need to somehow like fix it, right? Like, how much is that going to cost? Like, are you going to have to pay a really expensive monthly plan, for instance? And if you already have it in your brain, you're kind of obligated to do that. Like, are you not? So there's lots of like, I guess loopholes or things that you should be thinking about that will unfortunately, like, I think be left out of some conversations, but I think it's really difficult to think about these different perspectives. But that's where the value of having so many people and different stakeholders kind of involved in those conversations will bring. So that's
Mhm.
actually a really good example, honestly. So yeah. On that note, Dr. Cabrera, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a very interesting conversation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.